Good afternoon here in Sweden. Good morning, Klaus. How are you today?
Oh, I'm fine.
Fantastic.
I'm still having my coffee.
Yes, I have coffee too, but it's afternoon coffee. So, well, it's a great pleasure to have you here today and to talk with you about Popo and living with Popo, which is today's topic. But let me say a few words about you before we start. Well, Professor CLAUS SIEBE is a volcanologist at UNAM in Mexico City, and he works on active volcanic systems for well over 30 years. Klaus studied geology at the University of Tübingen in Germany, and he graduated there in 1986, and he received his PhD from Arizona State University in 1992. And since 92, he's employed in Mexico City at UNAM, and where he's teaching volcanology, volcanic hazards, pyroclastic processes, and related things. And his work is strongly focused on Mexican volcanoes, particularly in central Mexico. And he also touches the fields of archaeology and not just volcanic activity, effectively the interaction of volcanoes and human activity. And he has worked on Popocatépetl, or Popo for short, as one of his main topics, and he published over 80 ISI-papers in his career. And for the last 25 years, Klaus has also been a member of the advisory committee for the Mexican Secretary of the Interior to advise on geological hazards, particularly volcanic hazards. And he has served on a whole range of international committees, like for the IAFSE, the International Association of Volcanology and the Chemistry of the Earth Interior, where he was in the awards committee, he was in the Commission for Explosive Volcanism, etc. He spent time as a visiting researcher in Los Alamos in the USA, at Geomar Research Center in Germany, and in Clermont-Ferrand in France. And whoa, what a career, Klaus. It's a great pleasure to have you here today.
Yeah, I think you talk too much about me. Let's talk about
Well, you've worked too much, maybe. So, but anyway, so would you be happy to answer a few questions about Popo and about the topic I suggested, living with Popo?
Sure, sure. It's an honor to be with you, and I hope I can answer your questions.
Well, first of all, the pleasure is mine, and I'm sure you can. I mean, I visited you quite a few years back, and I mean, the things you've shown me, I'm very confident that you have a lot to say about these things. So I did these pre-formulated questions, and you had a few days to think about them as well. So let me plunge right in. The first questions we have here is Popocatépetl is a massive volcano and it's towering over Mexico City. And I was wondering, could you give us, particularly for the students, give us a quick summary, a geological background on the main hazards of Popo? What is the threats that Popo poses on the local population?
Well, yeah, let me first say something. You mentioned towering over Mexico City. That sounds like being at the base of the Lhotse face or something like that. In fact, the volcano is 60 kilometers away as the crow flies from downtown Mexico City. So it's not really towering, but you can, if the weather allows and pollution, you can see the volcano essentially from any place of the city at the horizon. So you can, if it emits, for example, an ash plume under favorable visibility, you can see that from the city. And yeah, the volcano is relatively large. It's more than 5,000 meters high, 5,252 to be exact. But the surrounding ground is already very high. It's a little bit above 2,000 meters. So the edifice is, yeah, 3,000 meters high, which is a pretty large edifice. And if you drive around, you find at a median distance, let's say 15, 20 kilometers, you find mostly pyroclastic deposits, Plinian pumice fallout deposits, pyroclastic flow deposits, and you also find, especially towards the south, debris avalanche deposits. And debris avalanche deposits, they attest to the collapse of the cone. And we have found so far 4 debris avalanche deposits, one on top of the other. And we have been able to date the last one. The last one is around 23,000 radiocarbon years old. Mm-hmm. So this means that the present summit cone of Popo was built during the past 23,000 years. And if we consider the size of the summit cone, that tells you something. And yes. What we know that since this emplacement of the debris avalanche deposit, at least 7 major Plinian eruptions have occurred. And the latest 2 occurred 1,100 years ago. That's the youngest. And the second youngest occurred around 2,000 years ago. And on both occasions, the area was already inhabited by humans. And that's why near Popo, it is frequent to find remains of human activity, mostly in the form of ceramic fragments or obsidian blade fragments underneath the Plinian deposits.
I see. So I guess trying to make sense of this, if there was a big Plinian eruption 2,000 years ago, 1,000 years ago, what's the likelihood of being another one now, and how would it affect the local surroundings? And you also mentioned ash deposits and things like that. I mean, ash might travel even further. What is the risk for the direct surroundings as well as for Mexico City?
Well, these Plinian eruptions, these are rather rare, relatively rare occurrences. Popocatépetl means smoking mountain.
Oh, does it? Okay.
Yes, so that's what it does most of the time. It emits a plume, and once in a while it has ash eruptions. And these dust nearby towns, but do not really represent a major threat. So people have gotten accustomed to this type of activity. But from the geologic record, we know that these large Plinian eruptions have also occurred. So this essentially means that we need to be prepared for the worst case scenario.
Yes.
And that's why we have focused so much of our time on this subject in order to make a hazard map, for example. A new hazard map was made a few years ago, where data and efforts from a large number of people were integrated into one document. And but the main problem really is the implementation of civil protection plans.
Okay.
As we have now seen during these days, these natural phenomena, for example, a pandemic, that affect large amounts of people, they immediately become, by their very nature, a political topic.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
And they become the center of all kinds of discussions and affect all sorts of interests that can be opposed. And then it becomes really difficult to navigate through this. And in the case of Popo, there are, within a radius of 100 kilometers, more than 30 million people living.
That's my big concern,
that makes
indeed.
It a special case, and yeah, and very challenging for the government and the politicians to deal with such an issue.
30 million people. Whoa. Yeah, no, I can see the problems that would be faced by the communities, by the society, if Popo was to erupt in a serious way. Very kind of scary to think of these numbers, to be honest, and the large eruptions. But hopefully Popo is not going to have a big Plinian eruption in the next time soon. And however, your point that Popo had these eruptions leads me on to my next question, and that is that there's some famous legends around Popo and the neighboring volcano Iztaccíhuatl. And I was wondering, what does that tell us about the volcano's behavior? And is there something we can learn from those kind of legends?
Well, specifically about Popo, as I said, Popocatépetl means smoking mountain. The neighboring volcano, a few kilometers to the north, is Iztaccíhuatl. Okay. That is also Nahuatl and means sleeping woman. And in prior years, during the winter time, the summit of Iztaccíhuatl was blanketed in white due to the snowfall. And if you would see the volcano from Mexico City or from the city of Puebla, which is on the opposite side of the volcano, it would actually, its profile would look like a lying woman.
Huh, okay.
Yeah. With a chest, a breast, and the feet, the head, and that there's a legend specifically about Iztaccíhuatl and Popocatépetl. It's an Aztec legend that it's a love story between the young princess Iztaccíhuatl and the young prince Popocatépetl, and they get engaged. I don't know, they're a big wedding is being organized, but then Popo has to go. He's a warrior. He has to go to war, goes into the battlefield against some enemy, and then some rumor is spread that he died in battle. And when Iztaccíhuatl hears about that, she becomes so sad that she lies down and dies. And ever since, she is sleeping or she's dead. But Popo didn't die. He then returns, and since then he guards the corpse of Iztaccíhuatl. Yeah. So that's specific legend about Popo, and well, there are several others. And what it tells you is that there's a general belief that Iztaccíhuatl, if we traduce this into geologic knowledge, Popocatépetl is the active volcano, and Iztaccíhuatl is a dormant or extinct volcano.
Right, I see.
Yeah. And then, but maybe what you referred to is to a creational myth among the Mesoamerican Indians in general, not just the Aztecs. And that is the myth of I think it's called, of the 5 suns.
Oh,
And accordingly, our solar system, or the Earth, undergoes periodically, or underwent periodically, some big cataclysm that includes the destruction of the sun. But the sun then becomes recreated, and life on Earth also bounces back. So I can't remember now the exact sequence of the cataclysms, but one is, for example, a flooding, a large flood, like in the Bible. And everybody succumbs. The sun disappears, doesn't show up for several days, and then it resurges and life bounces back. And on one of these occasions, then I remember, comes the era of giants. And I think that refers to mammoth bones that are profusely found in the lacustrine basins of central Mexico, because during the last ice age, Mexico, or central Mexico, the central highlands of Mexico, they were essentially a dry and cold steppe with abundant grasslands. So we had horses and I don't know, well, not horses, camelids and mammoths and other grazers, and you can find the bones of them frequently in excavations related to urban growth. And the last sun, that is called the sun of fire. And it essentially, what it describes is something that one could interpret as a Plinian eruption. So there's a big explosion.
okay.
And the sky becomes completely dark. And then the pieces of the exploded sun come down to the earth, rain down or hail down. So that would be the pumice fragments that form the Plinian deposits. And after a few days, a new sun is born and comes out, and life rebounces. So this is but this is a general legend. It does not refer specifically to Popocatépetl. But there are many stratovolcanoes in Mexico, of which we know that they have also experienced the Plinian eruptions. The most recent of which is actually Seboruco, that had a Plinian eruption around Anno Domini 1000, also quite well radiocarbon dated. This Plinian eruption was probably the most voluminous Plinian eruption in Mexico during the Holocene, even more voluminous than those from Popocatépetl. And not to forget, we had the Chichón eruption, which was also a Plinian eruption, only a few decades ago. And I guess that this fifth sun might refer, this fifth sun of this myth, the sun of fire, that this might relate to a Plinian eruption or circumscribe somehow a Plinian eruption.
This is very interesting, actually. I think it's very tempting to think that this cyclicity that is described might even fit to the different major eruptions. I don't know, but when you say that Popo erupted multiple times in the last few millennia, So, and other volcanoes as well. I think people might well get the impression of times that are changing or coming to an end, and then a new episode starting. So this is peculiar and intriguing. I kind of find this very interesting. Now, my next question would have been, is there any long-term hazard message that is wrapped into these legends? And I think you answered the question already. So there is probably something about these large eruptions that can really offset the way we know our surrounding and change life. And then, of course, as you said earlier about Popocatépetl and Iztaccíhuatl, about the active, potentially even angry volcano at times, and the dormant volcano on the other side. So that's, of course, meaning that there was a lot of human observation that has gone into these legends, I would think, and a message that has been, you know, transmitted over many centuries, potentially even longer, millennia. So despite these hazards, and that's the kind of next question I have, despite these seemingly negative experiences that people must have had, what is the benefits the volcanoes provide in the region for the local population? Moving away a little bit from the scary aspects of volcanoes now, looking at the positive aspects, the good sides of volcanoes. How will people, or how do people profit from the volcanic activity and the volcanic landscape and materials in the area?
Oh, well, that is easy to answer. Like in many other countries with volcanoes, especially with a mild subtropical climate like Mexico. I mean, for example, also Indonesia or Japan. Around volcanoes, you have quite fertile soils and that are valuable for agriculture. And in addition, volcanoes, like any other mountain, provide water. Essentially, these are water towers. And
so this is the water tower of Mexico City, I see.
Yeah, well, essentially a water tower. And if it's a very porous one, made out of lavas and pyroclastic deposits, well, it can hold even more water. And as a result, you have springs and streamlets coming down, with which you can irrigate your fields even during the dry season. So it makes areas around volcanoes, they yield enough food so you can start a civilization.
That sounds very good. And the rock is, of course, very interesting as well. You mentioned that volcanic rock is often very porous and water can flow through it. But of course, the rock is also a good building material, I would think.
Yes, in central Mexico, essentially before the advent of concrete, essentially any building was made out of volcanic rock, whether it was a pyramid or the colonial buildings that are made out of welded ignimbrite. I mean, all colonial churches are made out of ignimbrite.
Huh, I see.
And yeah, because it's a stone that is light.
Yeah.
So you can build a house of 2 or 3 stories because it's not so heavy, you know. It's relatively easy to cut into cubes or parallelepipeds. Yeah, you can also use volcanic rocks for making tools. I mean, the oldest tools that mankind has developed are grinding stones, for example, for making flour. And in central Mexico, these grinding stones have since thousands of years been made out of volcanic rock. Not to mention spearheads made out of obsidian or arrowheads, and so on and so forth. So essentially, our central Mexico is culturally impregnated by the products of volcanic activity.
That's my impression indeed. This is why I'm asking you, because this is why I called this little session today Living with Volcanoes, Living with Popo, because when I visited many years back, I felt the whole society was really intergrown with volcanic material, volcanic features, volcanic products, and this was I thought very, very interesting. And so local people have really learned how to use things there and make the best of it. So but can I ask a very quick questions about these grinding stones? This is a different material than what has been used for building the churches, I take it. Is this also kind of or is it the same ignimbrite material, or is this
No,
different type of rock?
The grinding stones are usually, they stem from lavas.
Okay, I see.
And in the case of central Mexico, mostly high silica andesites to dicites.
Okay.
So this means very viscous lavas, and of which there are plenty all over central Mexico. I mean, you might find such lavas from scoria cones, from stratovolcanoes. What is interesting is that they do not quarry any lava, but very specific parts of a certain lava.
Uh-huh. I figured that there must be some trick to this, because obviously a grinding stone has a completely different life or a task to kind of accomplish than a building stone for a church, which indeed, as you say, it's about building it high up and having a certain strength of the rock. At the same time, it doesn't have to be too massive, not too dense. But for a grinding stone, it's very different, I think. So what's so special about this high silica andesite? Tell me more.
Well, we don't know exactly, but I have several ideas in this respect. As a matter of fact, they walk for hours up a lava flow to a quarrying place where apparently the rock is optimal. And the reason for that is a grinding stone would last for an entire life. And in a typical household before electricity, mice or corn would be ground on these stones, and so women would spend essentially half of the day grinding corn. Mm-hmm. So you want to have the perfect grinding stone,
the best material you can possibly have.
It would last for their entire lifetime. And I've heard stories about when a woman used to pass away, that the daughters would have quarrels about who would inherit her grinding stone.
I see.
Yeah.
Oh my
so it
God.
used to be a really valuable item, and since so many hours would be spent behind the grinding stone, they wanted to have the perfect one.
Absolutely, I can imagine. I mean,
that explains why those that quarry them and work on them would walk 4 hours up the hill to the perfect quarry, get the stone, then you have to carry it back. They are heavy. So they get the finishing at the workshop in town, but the preform is being made at the original quarry site.
I see.
And I've talked to some of these artisans still exist. I mean, the consumption of grinding stones has obviously decreased enormously during the past decades, but there are a few places where they are still being quarried and they are still being made. And I've talked to the people and interviewed them why they choose this part of the lava flow and not the other. And it seems to be they want a rock that has a certain size of vesicle,
okay,
that is evenly distributed, and the rock also should be as hard as possible. They don't want that it is too soft, because then when you have too much of the stone in your sauce, yeah, in your tortillas.
yes. And then you're grinding down your teeth. Yeah, I can see that.
Yes, and but it should also be easy to clean after using. So you don't want that the food residues are in between or are filling the voids.
Yeah, of course.
So you want a combination of several attributes
physical features
that make the perfect grinding stone.
This is very interesting. No, I'm very fascinated by the use of volcanic products in human society, and these little delicate kind of differences, they are highly intriguing. And yes, I can see that it's quite worthwhile walking a few hours to a special site, particularly if you can save yourself potentially, say, an hour a day for a lifetime when you kind of grind the corn. So then spending 2 extra days to get the right rock is very little in comparison. So
Exactly.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Wow, fascinating. Now, the next question I have on our little list here is that there's plenty of archaeological sites in the region. And I was wondering, how did Popo influence ancient cultures in the region? And you said already a few words about tools like spearheads and arrowheads. And then you talked a little bit about colonial churches. But I mean, there's also a lot of pyramids in the area. I guess they're made of volcanic rock as well. Would you like to say a few more words about that?
Yeah, sure. Yes, around Popo, on its lower slopes, as we mentioned earlier, these areas are of interest for agriculture because you have a fertile soil stemming from finer grained pyroclastic deposits, and you have the water from the springs and the small creeks that come down the volcanoes. So that makes these areas of interest for example, having a hamlet already in ancient times. And around Popo, in recent decades, have been discovered underneath the last 2 Plinian deposits. So the one that is 2,000 years old and the younger one that is 1,100 years old, underneath have been found hamlets that were directly impacted by these eruptions. But so far, archaeologists have never found skeletons of, so it seems that people were able to leave the area before the culmination of the eruption. So there must have been, that's our interpretation, there must have been some strong signs that were convincing enough to induce the people to leave. And but we can see that the huts collapsed The roofs that were made out of organic material are charcoalized, and the household items have been essentially found in place. Yeah, so it seems that these places were directly impacted by the eruptions, but people had left before. So one interpretation that exists is that these eruptions probably, especially the one that occurred 2,000 years ago, might have triggered nucleation of populations at certain distances from Popo, like, for example, Teotihuacan in the northern part of the basin of Mexico, and Cholula in the basin of Puebla, and that this then initiated essentially or contributed to urbanization. That from a more dispersed societies or living in a more dispersed manner, such an eruption like the one that occurred 2,000 years ago might have contributed to the nucleation in urban sites, because obviously these people then must have sought for refuge with other people, and since their fields were destroyed, or if they had food on store somewhere, that might have been lost, so they essentially must have sought for help elsewhere. But this is an issue that still requires much further investigation. But we have definitely abundant evidence that these eruptions directly impacted people living on the lower slopes of the volcano and beyond, because we have, after these Pleiadian eruptions, we had a very substantial laharic flooding, very much like the flooding that was observed in the 1991 eruption of Pinatubo, where really very extensive areas were flooded and impacted by post-Pleiadian lahars. Such evidence we have found at Popo also. So we know that the areas affected are not only on the slopes of the volcano, but also beyond.
I'm fascinated because, I mean, for me as a listener, I just can't help but associate that with the legends you said earlier about these repeated kind of, new episodes following on from catastrophe of large flooding and suns that are exploding. So, I mean, you just basically kind of gave the potential physical events that would have wiped out a certain episode of human settlement and then gave rise to a new one, perhaps slightly further afield. So I can't help but think that there must be some connection there. But of course, I wouldn't know, but it sounds too tempting to kind of bring these two sides together. I'm really kind of fascinated by this. Thank you, Klaus. This is great. So yeah, I have one final question, if you don't mind. And that is having looked at what Popo has done in the past, having looked at how people have interacted with Popo in the past, having also looked a little bit at what people do today or have done in recent history with volcanic materials. I guess the question is really, how will Popo behave in the future? I mean, people always wonder, when will the volcano erupt? When can we predict eruptions? And I'm more than aware that it's very hard to kind of put a finger on exactly what will happen. But can you give us a sense of how Popo might kind of behave in the future from the knowledge you have gathered in your decades of study?
Well, that question is not so difficult to answer. It will essentially most probably continue behaving as it has in the past decades. But eventually, it will experience a Pleiadian eruption. Of course, we do not know when this will occur. And there is a monitoring system around the volcano. And my best guess is that this monitoring system will improve with time as new technologies surface around the globe. Some of them will be implemented there too, etc. And that at one point we might be able to, based on the monitoring system, forecast with maybe, with greater precision, an impending eruption. The problem always is not if one is going to happen within the next days. I mean, we have gotten to that point that we usually can anticipate that something will happen. The problem is more to say what is going to be the magnitude of what is going to happen. And of course, this poses an enormous challenge. But if you look at all of this from a more wider perspective, the issue here is we don't only have Popo. I mean, we have essentially a dozen of volcanoes capable of doing that. And maybe it's not going to be Popo the next one. It's going to be one that we are at present not even really looking at. So if you want to really look at this from a broader perspective and do something in this respect, we really need to do more fundamental work at this point, reconstruct the histories, not only of Popo, because I mean, Popo, essentially, we have a good knowledge now of its more recent geologic history. But there are other volcanoes in central Mexico that maybe are not as densely, the surroundings are not as densely inhabited as Popo, but also pretty, with a relatively large populations around that nobody is really looking at. And so we should really have try to get a better perspective on eruptions that could occur at other Mexican volcanoes or other places in the world for this matter, that at this point, nobody is looking at. I mean, who knew about Chichon until it erupted? Who knew about Pinatubo until it erupted? I mean, that seems to be a more common case than not.
Yes, that's very interesting that you say that. I came across this expression a little while back about black swan events, i.e. the things we don't expect and they come out of nowhere. Yes, you're quite right in pointing that out, that Popo is the obvious threat because it is very tall and you can see it from a distance, and it's got a clear record. But of course, there is of course a risk that some of the lesser well-known, less studied volcanoes may develop into a threat, and this may not have been quite led to the right level of preparation in the local communities. I can see that as well. So when I get this right, what you're saying is that there's decades of further research ahead that still needs to be done.
Yeah. I mean, we also have to put this all into the perspective of other things that are going on. I mean, if you see the massive migrations occurring nowadays on the globe that are not related to volcanic eruptions, I mean, that if you add a Pleiadian eruption here or there to that, it is not really much.
It's not a key problem, you think?
No, I mean, there are severe problems already. And that is, I mean, this is, in essence, this is one of the problems that we volcanologists face, that if you want to convince governments to fund your work, you first have to convince them that your problem is bigger than the other problems that are on their table.
It's interesting that you say that. I heard this before. I heard this in Indonesia. I mean, there is, of course, a lot of active volcanoes, but you kind of have to convince authorities that the volcanoes are more dangerous than this disease or these rebels or something like that. So, yeah, I can see that.
I mean, it is certainly true. One can easily become an annoyance.
Yes.
I mean, I've heard this. I have other problems. You don't need to invent a new one for me. Yeah.
Yeah, and then of course, I mean, the likelihood that your volcano will just erupt in your kind of period of residing in a certain task as a politician, I mean, is relatively small. So you might think that I'll get through these 4 years of whatever it is being in that function without the volcano erupting, and you might have a good chance that nothing will happen then. So I can see as a politician, it might be very attractive not to worry about volcanoes. But I think your point is made, at least to me, that these volcanoes and Popo in particular is a severe threat. There can be quite serious effects once a major eruption comes about. And obviously Popo has produced such eruptions in the past. So joking.
Exactly, yeah. I think that the worst volcanic eruptions in terms of victims are yet to occur somewhere in the world, especially due to the increase in population living around them.
That's what I actually think, because you said 30 million people live in the direct surroundings there. I mean, eruptions in the ancient past were surely devastating, but the population density, or what's sometimes referred to as the population volcanic vulnerability index, it must have risen enormously in the last decades or century compared to previous kind of historical situations. So I think this is what I'm particularly personally worried about, that an eruption that would have been devastating 1,000 years ago, it would be a complete disaster, catastrophe if it happened today. Or am I getting this wrong here?
No, I think it is, I think volcanoes represent a very serious threat. I could name several dozen that I have seen, and with substantial populations living at their base. But in our context, with all these other problems, political problems, and I mean, just mentioned the pandemic, for example, yeah, it becomes increasingly difficult to get the attention on a problem like a volcano, especially since they erupt catastrophically so unfrequently.
Yes, it's not on a human time scale, and human memory is relatively short. Even generation memory is relatively short. I mean, it's very hard. I mean, when I think back to my family history, everything beyond my great grandfather is in a haze. So I mean, volcanoes that erupt on a cyclicity of several hundred years, repose periods, I mean, we lose that knowledge, obviously. No, I can see that. And the pandemic is obviously much more in your face, so to speak. It's a direct threat of your daily life. So yeah, I can see that problem. So I guess that that brings us to the end. I don't have an answer to that, but I can just hope that Popo stays quiet and the other volcanoes are kind of joining Popo in his kind of slumber for the next little while. Certainly, we would not want volcanic eruptions plus pandemics coming together. That would be a particularly nasty kind of surprise, I would think. So what's the current situation? What do you think? Is Popo going to be quiet for a little while longer?
Let's hope so.
Let's hope so. Okay, fair enough. Well, Klaus, this was great. I really enjoyed this. Thank you so much. I learned a lot, and I'm quite fascinated by, you know, bringing the past together with the future here and how humans interact with volcanoes. And your insight has been, Yeah, really informative. So thank you very much. And let's hope Popo stays quiet, and let's hope the pandemic in these weird days is calming down as well. I would really kind of like to see that. Thank you for your time, Klaus.
No, it has been my pleasure.
Oh,
And,
the pleasure was all mine, honestly. Thank you so much. Okay, then I say goodbye and all the very best. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Stay safe.
You too. Bye.